like I was saying, I left the office at 5:30 on the dot. I was not going to be late for this, and I only had 12 miles to go and 30 minutes to get there, but in Orange County traffic, you just never know. So I left right on the money, and as I'm driving on this freeway, I start thinking back and playing through these 10 years. Moments mostly, really it's like first times, like the first step. I start thinking through that. First word. And I exit the freeway, and I'm looking for this place. I've never been there, but Garden Grove is a town I'm going to. It's full of these strip malls, so I pull in, and I think I found the place. It's got purple letters up on the storefront, and I park, and I'm there a little bit early, so I wait. And I know I've got about 5-6 minutes until they get there. As I sit there, I play through some more, and now I'm thinking through first birthday. That was a great one. And then I come to the second one, and then I start thinking through the third birthday. 3 years after she was born, and as I'm thinking through that day, I see them pull up. They're in a separate car. Kirsten, both kids hop out. They're walking out in front. They don't see me yet. And as they pull up and they walk out and they enter that storefront, I'm focused just on her. I'm focused just on those 10 years. I'm thinking back. It's been a ride. And I go in and I tell him, here I am, and Dylan runs up to me and he hugs me. He's got this little like Lego car and he plays the whole time. And I watch her, 10 years of age. She walks up to the counter. She says, I've got a 6 o'clock appointment. And they open a book and they start going through it. And they're like, this or this or this. And she says yes, she says no, and then they finally say, okay, it's time. Since there's 2, you get to, bring back mom or dad, or you can bring back one for one and one for the other. She goes, I want mom first, and then I want dad. So they walk back, and I'm sitting out there. And as I'm sitting out, I start playing back the night of that third birthday. And each birthday for her first 2 years, I'd put her to bed, tuck her in, and I talked to her a little bit. The first one, she didn't answer anything. The second one, she tried. The third one, I asked her, what is it that you really, really want? And then they come out, and they're like, okay, time for number 2. I walk back there, and I come around, and then there's this like doorway with no door, and I'm looking back at her. She's sitting in a gigantic chair, way too big for her little 10-year-old body, and as she's sitting there, she's kind of cringing, kind of smiling. I can tell the first one didn't hurt too much. And they say, time for the second one. Dad, do you want to come in? I ask her, do you want me to? She goes, no, stay by the door. And they go up to her, they take a little staple-like thing, and pop, number 2 goes in. And it hit me, what she said on that night, third birthday. She said, the only thing that I want is to never, ever get my ears pierced. And it's been 10 years, and I'm watching her as it goes pop, and things are different. I would always ask her on her birthdays, too, since then, what do you want to be? On that third birthday, she wanted to be a ballerina princess zookeeper. Do you remember that? Ballerina princess zookeeper. From then, we started to take it down a notch. So birthday number 5, she only wanted to be a zookeeper. Birthday number 7, she'd already built up. Now she wanted to be a veterinarian. There'd always been this like love for animals throughout the whole thing. Birthday number 10, that night I took her in and I asked her, what do you want to be when you grow up? And 10 years had gone by and things had changed. Do you guys remember that? Have you been there? What did you want? Can you recall what you wanted to be when you grew up? Who can remember? What was it? A veterinarian? Okay, I'm looking for somebody creative. Jen. A nurse. You wanted to be a nurse. What do you want to be when you grow up now? A nurse. So veterinarian, did you always have that, like going back to, or did it just like hit you one day? Okay. Who else remembers? Yes. An astronaut. Love of space, is that what it was? Or discovery? Or you just like the suits? Or you wanted to get away from somebody? Who else remembers? One more. Yes. Airline stewardess. That's okay. And I'll take this one too. What? A lawyer. Are you guys hearing me okay? Yeah, I really apologize about that. I've actually had it off the whole time. I'm kidding. So today we jump into a text, and we're at Exodus 20, and I have to apologize. That's like midway through the story. In fact, you're only 5 chapters short of being at exactly midway, Exodus. a book of 50 chapters. We're at chapter 20, and it starts like this. If you've got your Bible, you guys are all looking at me. Where are your Bibles? There you go. Grab one. It starts like this. Here we go. Then the Lord spoke all of these words. And every time that you see a text in the Bible, a sentence that begins with the word then, you have to ask when. You can't let that slide. Every time you see a then, the Lord spoke all these words, you have to ask when. When did God speak all these words? Every time you see a New Testament text that says, then Jesus got off the boat, you have to ask when. What's going on around it? And for the sake of time, and since we're short on time, I'm only going to go back to Genesis 1 to give you, I'm only going to go back to early Exodus to give you guys a context. Pastor Phil was very clear, I've only got an hour and a half. So if you guys are going away for the weekend, sorry. If you go back to the beginning of Exodus, here's what you get. You've got a nation that just walked in, 77 total. They come from one guy, a guy named Jacob. He was a descendant of Isaac, descendant of Abraham. At this point, they've grown into a family of 70. He's got 12 sons. They've got married, they've been married, they have children, and they're in Canaan. But in Canaan, there's a famine. So they look, where's there's food? Where's their life? And from Canaan, they see in Egypt. In Egypt, there's food. In Egypt, we can survive. In Egypt, we can find life. Let's take our kids, let's take our wives, our family, go to Egypt. Interesting, right? That at one point, the salvation land was Egypt, and that death was in Canaan. That certainly, that flopped around. But they head down to Egypt, 70 of them. And in there, they prosper, they grow. In Exodus 1, we learn that they multiplied greatly and that their numbers increased. And just like it happens when the people of God are multiplying and doing well, evil strikes back. So the Pharaoh, who did not know about Joseph, he said, we've got to cut this short. We've got to end this. There's too many of them. If we go to war and they don't like us, they're going to join our enemies and they're going to defeat us. So we've got to stop them. So they enslaved them. They started to oppress them. And over time, the oppression didn't work. They just grew more and they multiplied more greatly. And he said, this isn't working. Take away all of their straw and give them more bricks to make. And they did that, and they grew, and they multiplied greatly until he said, I'm done. This is over. From now on, here's what you do. Every newborn son, you take him, you drown him in the Nile. That's the plan. That's how we stop this. And in the midst of this oppression, in the midst of this violence, how does God respond? He sends a helpless baby boy. Go figure. Born to a slave. And for 3 months, they try to hide him. At 3 months, baby's lungs grow, you'll see. And then they can't hide him anymore. He starts wailing and screaming. So they say, what do? We can't hide him. And they did the only thing they could. They make a little basket out of tar and pitch and straw, and they put him in the Nile, to the letter almost of the law. But they didn't follow the Spirit. Go figure, God uses an instrument of death for the purposes of salvation. He takes the baby and is found by Pharaoh's daughter. He grows up in the palace 40 years later. Moses looks out at a field where the Egyptians are working the Israelites. The oppression and slavery has now gone on 430 years approximately. And he looks out and he has an identity crisis. He grew up in an Egyptian palace with Egyptian education. But somewhere deep inside, he knows it's wrong. Somewhere deep inside, he sees he's beating one of my own people. So he goes out, kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. Word gets out, Pharaoh comes after him, and Moses flees. He's exiled to Midian on the lower end of the Sinai desert, and there he gets married. He builds a family. He gets a job as a shepherd. And 40 years after that, at 80, God shows up again. And he says, Moses, I know I'm a burning bush that's not burning, but I need you to listen. I need you to come closer. Actually, stop there. Take off your sandals. I need you to go back to Egypt. And Moses goes, what? That's the place where they want to kill me. That's the place where I'm wanted for murder. I can't go back there. God says, yeah, I know. But those people that wanted you to kill you, they're dead. I need you to go back because my people, they're suffering. 430 years of suffering. I need you to go back and free them. Moses says, I can't speak well. I'll send your brother. They're not going to believe me. Use your staff. It becomes a snake. They're not going to believe me still. God's anger burned. Moses goes. He takes his kid, he takes his wife, puts him on a donkey. Off to Egypt they go. 10 plagues later, they're leaving Egypt. They come to a sea. God parts it, drowns an Egyptian army. And in chapter 15 of Exodus, we get the first corporate worship service. They take up tambourines, they take up dancing instruments, they worship God like never before. Then they walk for 3 months in the desert. They come to a mountain called Sinai. And at Sinai, they stop. At Sinai, God says, Moses, come. Back up the mountain you go. I need you to tell the people, in 3 days, I'm going to talk to them. In 3 days, I need them to be ready. In 3 days, they're going to see God. So these people who so far, they've just been following a guy with a beard and a staff that turns into a snake. They finally say, okay, we saw the plagues, we saw the snake, we saw the sea. We're finally going to get to see the God behind it all. So 3 days of anticipation, 3 days of whispering in clusters around tents, 3 days of thinking, what's he going to look like? Is he going to come in a chariot pulled by unicorns of different colors? Probably not. What's he going to look like? So they're whispering and they're talking and they're waiting and they're anticipating. And so the third morning comes around. And that's chapter 20. So when we get to the then God spoke all these words, that's where we are. After 3 days, 430 years of slavery, 3 months in the desert, 3 days of waiting, then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You must have no other gods before me. And to us, that's kind of common. We know this text, right? What's at the beginning to? What comes next? Oh, you guys don't know this. Okay, the Ten Commandments come next. That's the introduction to the Ten Commandments. We know that, we've seen that, we've read that, we've heard it, right? Ten Commandments come next. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You will have no other gods before me. And so we don't think too much about that, right? Like you read that, and what do you think? What comes to mind? Who's got ideas about that? Not too many. Neither do I, really, when I read it the first time. But that's because I am not an ancient Hebrew boy. If I were, though, I would recognize the formula. There was this formula that was commonplace back then. By the way, is that the clock that I'm using? That clock's off. It's ahead by like 30 minutes. Furthermore, I can hardly see it, so it's not my fault. There's a formula that they would have recognized. They would have seen it. When a conquering, let's say, master would come into a town, a very common thing to do was to erect this thing in the middle of town. It's a statue. It's called a stele. You guys may have heard of them, maybe seen pictures. A stele had two things on it. At the very, very top, it usually peaked like an obelisk. At the very top, it had imagery, much like a stained glass window at a church. They told a story. Usually, you would see the new ruler on there, and you would see one of two things. Maybe on one side, you would see that ruler stabbing somebody with a massive sword, way too big, much bigger than his actual sword was. And on the other side, you would see that ruler standing in front of a throne, and on that throne was a god, and that god was handing him something, and that something was a scroll, and on that scroll were a bunch of laws. And then below that, on the lower half of the stele, lower half of the statue, you would have the actual laws. A very common one, probably the best known one, is the Code of Hammurabi. You guys have heard of that, right? If you look at that thing, it's got Hammurabi at the top, getting a scroll from the god, Shamash. And then beneath that, 282 laws. And at the top of those laws, there was always a preface, always a prelude. And that prelude had two things. One thing was, I am such and such. I am Hammurabi. And then beneath that, part two of the prelude, it said, I have conquered this city, and this city, and this city, and I have slain this king, and this king, and this king, and I have built this city, and this city. In other words, name and then accomplishments as a basis. The laws beneath that were all a therefore. These are my laws because I am Hammurabi, and this is what I've done. Look at Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. What do you see? Do you see the formula? But what's the difference? What's the difference? Instead of saying, I am Hammurabi who conquered all these towns, what does this one say? Yeah. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt. I am God who freed you. Just the opposite. Do you see that? And that brings us to our first theological point. First theological point. I've been talking like 20 minutes. I just got to something. Wendy, since you're awesome at this, tell me, verse number 2, what does it say? What's it about? Right, it's if you were to put it in one word, one nutshell word, verse 2 is about what? Salvation. Now look at verse 3. What's verse 3? Verse 3 is the first what? First commandment. Check this out. What comes first? In the Old Testament text, smack in the middle of our Old Testament, what comes first? Salvation or the law? Salvation. Is that confused? I mean, the first time that I saw that, the first time that I realized that order of Old Testament theology, I thought that is so different than what I've always heard. I've always had this this juxtaposition between Old Testament God and New Testament God, right? Here we have like justice and here we have mercy. Here we have violence and here we have grace. Here we have like punishment and here we have love. And this one expects you to obey, but he loves you and he saves you and he's your buddy. And this one, like you touch his ark, the earth will swallow you. I've always thought that. And then I come to Exodus 20, the prelude to the Ten Commandments, and I get slapped in the face with God's mercy. Old Testament God, New Testament God, salvation comes first. Every time, hands down. It just so happens that I had it wrong. I didn't realize how much like his father Jesus was. That's point number 1. Let's go on to point number 2, and this is what I really want to get to. How much time do I actually have? Should I even ask? Pastor Phil Phillips. Another 20 minutes, he said? Verse number 4. Are we good so far? Yeah? You guys, everybody, most of you are awake. Here we go. Do not make an idol for yourself. So tell me about that. You guys know this commandment, right? This one's obvious, this one's second. This is one of the top 3 that people can rattle off. Usually they can tell you this one, they can tell you don't murder, and then they can tell you something that sounds like the golden rule. But commandment number 2, do not make an idol. What do you make of that? What's that really about? How do we understand that? Any thoughts, even if they're wrong? My common understanding is to not take something and elevate it to the level of God. Right? Who's with me on that? Who's always thought about it that way? Oh. There is an actual more like face value of that commandment. Do not make an idol, literally speaking. In the most literal sense, what is that commandment? If you didn't take it and apply it to contemporary terms and say, I can make anything an idol, my money, my profession, my family, my schedule, anything. If you didn't do that, what's the commandment about? Don't do what? Like what things? But like literally though, it says, do not make an idol. Like what is the commandment? Yeah, that's exactly like literally speaking, the most literal understanding of verse 4 part A is just don't make statues of stuff. Don't make graven images of stuff. Interesting, right? Like you think like, wow, that's super simplistic and also kind of weird. Why can't we do that? We've got such a fuller understanding now that we've taken that basic meaning and applied it in all these cool modern ways. Like I can take anything and idolize it. I can become an idolater with just about anything that I elevate, up with God. And that's what I'm not supposed to be doing, right? We've done that. And so we've taken that commandment and we've kind of expanded it to that, right? Like don't idolize things to the point where they decentralize God. Like if you've got this job, and that's your basis for security, and that's what your schedule revolves around, and that's what your communication revolves around, then you've idolized that thing. If you've got a family, if you've got a home or a car or a really, really cool, tie, like anything that you take and you say, this is the thing around which all else revolves. You say, like, that's what this commandment's against. That's what it's telling you to stop doing. Don't put things in the place of God, right? You're with me? But then check this out. Like, I've been there for so long, and then I get to part B of verse 4, and it says this. Do not make an idol for yourself in the form of anything, in heaven above, or on the earth, or on the waters below the earth. Did you guys catch that? Do not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything. Where? Where was that? On the earth, and where else? In the sea, and in the heavens above. So that includes what? Everything, and it includes who? It includes God. And so I read that and I was like, wait, what? Like, I thought I had this pinned down. I knew that it wasn't just about little statues, but then I thought, how can I make an idol of God? Like, what does that even mean? Have you guys thought about that? I'd never once thought about that until that thing, like, I read this really closely like 10 minutes ago. Like, I'd never really thought about that. But how can you even do that? How can you make an idol of God? Some of you shaking your head, you're like, nope, you can't. How can you do that? Choir, any ideas? How can you make an idol of God? You don't have to sing it.
Just kind of putting him on a pedestal, but not doing what he wants everyone to do. Just isolating him up.
Right, so that
making it a thing,
not like a dynamic relationship. So like the two comments back there, like they said putting God on a pedestal, but then not really like doing what he said. Like that's super interesting. Like if I told my daughter, go clean your room, Eliza, who's 10 now, I say, go clean your room, and she goes up 30 minutes, she comes down. I said, did you clean your room? She says, no, but I thought about it. So I studied the instruction, go clean your room, and in 30 minutes, 5 of my friends are going to come over. We're going to sit in a circle, and we're going to talk about what it would look like if I clean my room. And I think, like, isn't that what I do all the time? Like, I study this, and I think, like, oh, that's what God wants me to do. Am I going to do it? No. But I'm going to gather up with people on Tuesday night, and we're going to talk about what it would look like if we did. Have you guys done that? Like, that's taking God, making him an idol of this thing, but it doesn't really matter. We've put him into, like, an image, right? You've taken God and put him in an image. Now, 2 minutes left? 2, like, it doesn't matter. So the real basis is actually a bit historical here. They came out of an Egyptian culture that had a belief that if you can get the deity's personal name, or if you can put the deity in a statue, you had some level of management over it. It was a superstition. It was a belief. It was a heresy to some degree. And so what God was saying, don't go thinking that you can take what you think about me, put it into a statue, and therefore think you can control me. Because I'm not a God that stands for manipulation. I'm a God that moves, that breathes, that's alive. I'm a God that can change his mind. I'm a God that can regret. I'm a God that can say, I made all these people that I loved, and now they're evil, I'm going to drown them. I'm a God that can say, I want to take you guys out of Egypt because you're my nation, you're my people, but you know what? You've been bad. Moses, you're not crossing the river. We have a God that will not be confined to an image. And it takes that shape too, but it also impacts prayer life. I had a grandma that used to say, hey guys, I'm going to go to bed. I want you to know I'll be praying. Does anybody want anything? Unfortunately, she passed away. But like that was my favorite grandma. So we have that, like we've got that idea that we can take everything we know about God, and if we work it just right, we can get God to do what we want. And as soon as we do that, we've taken what God did initially, where he made an image of himself, and we've done the opposite. Do you guys see that? Instead of being God's image on this planet, like he created us to be, we've taken God and made him in ours. What's commandment number 2 against? Manipulating God. Thinking that we have the power to control, thinking that we have the ability or the right to take God and construe him into a shape that we like, that fits what we want. and he'll do it. And we do that with programs. We do that at a church, like I've done it, like where I've taken a Bible study that I thought was going great, and it went great for a few years, and then I moved to a different church and I try to duplicate it because I've put God in a box. I've said, God, you're my image. I've got this little idol of you. What I did there is going to work here, and it just doesn't. It falls apart. We've got a growing young thing coming up that Wendy described as renewing the church. We can't do that if we idolize the way God works. If we confine God to a tradition, a habit, a memory, we petrify him and suck the life out of him. Commandment number 2 is against being life-sucking idolaters that petrify God into an image and completely freeze church growth, spiritual development, community, worship. It freezes everything. Commandment 2 impacts every area of life and mind. And sometimes it takes the shape of people. It takes me a while to remember that I don't have to be, and I'm not, the guy that in the first year of marriage made so many bad financial choices that I drove our finances into the ground. It sneaks up sometimes that I'm not that. I do not need to make an idol of who I was. I have life. I can change. My daughter can change. Put that photo up real quick. That's her at 3 going like this, don't ever pierce my ears. So my question is like, do I miss that? Yes. I really, really do. Put the next one up. That's Eliza at 10. She's got piercings in both ears. Is she any less my little girl? No. But is she the same as she was at 3? No. Eliza changed. Eliza grew. In 5 years, I'm going to have a picture of her at 15, and I have no idea what she's going to want to be, but that's okay. Because she's alive. She's not my idol. She's my daughter. He's not our idol. He's our God. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for texts that are old and ancient, and yet they have life. Thank you for being a God that listens. A God that meets us where we are, regardless of where we've been, what we've done, and that says we can try again. Thank you for making us the way we are and for being exactly the way you are. Amen.